I want to talk about something that I haven't heard said about war. I know there are laws of war and the Geneva Conventions, and everyone can argue about whether or not rules have been followed. There are organizations like the ICC whose members are under sanction by the US government. But the reality is, nations choose when, how, and if they are going to follow. I'm sure I'm going to say things that people are not going to like. More so, I'm sure a lot of historians and political strategists are going to disagree. But it should be said, killing your way to victory has been the way wars have been won throughout history. Throughout history, death and suffering has ended wars and changed ideologies. This is what won World War II and more recently ISIS. It wasn't protecting the populace. And this is for wars. There are many options besides wars. Targeted strikes and targeted killings work because most of the time there's no escalation and terrible things or people have been eliminated, making the world better and safer. Israel bombed the Osirak nuclear reactor in 1981. The results? Iraq no longer had a nuclear program. During Trump's first term, he killed Soleimani. The results? Iran shot a couple missiles at Al-Assad Air Base, and a strategic member of the Iranian threat network was eliminated. But then there was October 7th, and October 7th could have been significantly worse if there was more coordination between the Iranian proxies, which could have happened if Soleimani was not killed. However, there are times when war is necessary, and history has shown resorting to barbarism is the surest way to victory. Nazi ideology was killed with approximately 10% of Germany. Japanese imperialism was killed with approximately 5% of Japan. During World War II, it was understood that killing your way to victory was the way to victory. It gets parroted that the Soviets lost Afghanistan. However, the government that they installed lasted for over 3 years after they left. The government was falling apart as we were leaving. How much did the amount of killing the Soviets did lead to the government lasting? And how much did our lack of killing result in the government immediately collapsing? Every major conflict the US has fought since World War II has been a failure. Killing your way to victory in Korea and Vietnam was superseded by a fear of escalation. For Iraq and Afghanistan, was it superseded by a false belief that we have evolved past fighting wars this way? I spent a lot of my adult life in the GWOT, and I don't know what was going on. Strategy to win wars was replaced by catchphrases like, "You can't kill your way to victory," "We need to protect the populace," "We need to separate the insurgency from the populace," and my favorite, "How many insurgents is this creating?" Know who asked that question first? How many insurgents is this creating? It was Curtis LeMay as he was ordering his pilots to fly lower so they would kill more people. Insurgents are created until they aren't. There was no real insurgency after World War II. There was the werewolf insurgency, but it was so ineffective it's basically a footnote in history. That's because the German populace had suffered so much during World War II, they no longer had the will to continue with an insurgency. We killed our way to victory. The Korean War gave us North Korea, and the world is not better for it, especially for the ones living in North Korea. This didn't need to be the case. We limited the way that war was fought for fear of escalation. This is an argument that continuously comes up, this fear of escalation. We're seeing it now with what's going on with Ukraine and Israel. Escalation will lead to something worse, but it probably won't. Would escalating to win during the Korean War have led to more Chinese involvement? China had just lost potentially over 25 million people from the Second World War to their civil war to Mao's policies and purges, yet they still sent over 2.5 million troops to fight in North Korea. Could they have sent more? Maybe they had more people and resources to send. I don't think this is likely. The other escalatory concern was of Russia. Russia did just become a nuclear power. However, they had lost potentially over 35 million people from World War II to Stalin's policies and purges. Also not likely. Escalation is a possibility, but the concern in a just war needs to be on victory. For Korea, the economic sanctions against China should have intensified. China should have faced a naval blockade. There should have been surveillance flights and bombing of the staging areas in Manchuria. This could have resulted in a decisive victory for South Korea. Instead, the limits and constraints have given the world the Kim family regime, wasting more blood and treasure than what would have resulted from a decisive victory. And this is what should be kept in mind. Not achieving a decisive victory has been considerably worse for the world. It's tough to make the argument that Vietnam was a just war. Maybe countries like Singapore were able to develop without facing their own communist insurgency. This could be one of the only good things that came out of the Vietnam War. But the realities were not many in South Vietnam were interested in fighting. South Vietnam never had a unifying and stable government. The monks who were self-immolating, they weren't protesting the war, they were protesting the government of No Dien Diem. The idea of domino theory, Laos and Cambodia also fell to communism. It didn't really matter. But we went to war in Vietnam and we decided to fight a limited and constrained war. All of the ordnance of Operation Rolling Thunder from 1965 to 1968 could have been dropped on Hanoi and Haiphong instead of random places in the jungle. 11 days of bombing Hanoi and Haiphong in 1972 brought North Vietnam back to the peace negotiations. 3 years of bombing, dropping more ordnance than what was dropped in all of the Pacific theater during World War II on Hanoi and Haiphong, could have brought about the level of death and suffering that ends wars. We ignored what we learned in World War II. Killing your way to victory is the way to victory. Then we had Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. Striking Afghanistan after September 11th was definitely justified. Iraq is a debate, but should either one have turned into a war? The Taliban fell within the first 2 months of fighting. Saddam's forces fell within the first month. Then we failed at nation building for 20 years in Afghanistan. The only instance where this kind of worked was with the Sunni awakening, and that's because they hated AQI more than they hated us. Protecting the populace is a losing strategy. The Marshall Plan post-World War II was one of America's most successful operations. But how much did the death and suffering from World War II result in the success of the Marshall Plan? If the populace of Iraq and Afghanistan suffered as much as the populace of Germany and Japan, would we have had different results at nation building? The lesson to take is we should not go to war unless it is worth resorting to barbarism. Again, there are other options besides war. We could have left both Iraq and Afghanistan after the regimes collapsed in the first couple months. Nothing good came out of failing at nation building. Protecting the populace is a failed strategy. Limiting the brutality of war only prolongs the conflict and results in worse outcomes.